I'm 68 years old. I worked 34 years for the Postal Service, and I raised 2 kids in a house I bought with my own sweat. So when I tell you I've never been the kind of man who snoops through other people's business, you better believe that's the God's honest truth. My name is Vincent Rodriguez. I'm retired. I live in Mesa, Arizona. I've had enough time now to say it plainly, without my hands shaking, without my voice going somewhere I don't want it to go. For a long time I couldn't talk about this. Now I think I have to, because if you're my age and you're watching this, there's a chance some part of what I'm about to tell you will sound familiar, and I'd rather you hear it from someone who came out the other side. It was a Sunday afternoon in March of 2024, one of those clean, quiet Arizona Sundays where the sky goes pale blue and the air still carries a little cool before the summer heat takes over for good. I'd been out back trimming the oleanders along the wall, the kind of slow, satisfying work that reminds a man he still has good years left in him. My son Derek had called earlier that morning asking to borrow my pipe wrench and a channel lock, said he had a bathroom faucet giving him trouble. I told him to come by, left the tools on the porch, and went back to my yard. He stopped at around 2 in the afternoon. I stayed maybe 20 minutes. We talked about nothing much. His truck, the heat coming, whether the Diamondbacks had anything worth watching that season. He grabbed the tools, gave me a half hug the way men do, and left. I walked back inside to wash up. His phone was sitting on the kitchen counter. A Samsung, face up, screen still lit from a notification that must have just come in. He'd set it down when he came inside for a glass of water and walked out without it. I picked it up, meaning to call after him, maybe flag him down before he pulled out of the driveway, but by the time I reached the front door, his truck was already gone. Dust is still settling on the road. I set the phone back on the counter, figured I'd text him on my own, but before I could turn away, another notification buzzed across the top of the screen. The phone was still lit, still unlocked, and in that little gray preview bubble, I saw 6 words that stopped me where I stood. Your dad won't even remember by Tuesday. I've had my share of senior moments. I won't pretend otherwise. But there was something in those words that didn't feel like a joke between friends. It felt like a calculation. I stood there for a long moment. 34 years of sorting other people's mail taught me one thing above all else. You don't open what isn't addressed to you. That's not just a postal rule. That's a code I've lived by. But a father's instinct is older than any code. I picked up the phone. That single decision would destroy something I'd spent a lifetime building. And at the same time, it would save everything that still mattered. What I found in those messages, I wasn't ready for. No father ever could be. The first message I saw said, "Your dad won't even remember by Tuesday." And right then, I should have put the phone down and walked away. But something in my gut told me this wasn't just some offhand comment. I opened the messaging app. The conversation was between Derek and a contact saved as Nikki, Nicole, his wife of 9 years. I'd been to their wedding. I'd held their 2 kids at the hospital, a boy named Caleb and a girl named Lily, 6 and 4 years old that spring. I'd fixed Derek and Nicole's water heater at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night because Derek said he didn't know how. The message above the preview read, "Did he buy the refinance story?" Derek's reply, time-stamped 20 minutes earlier. Hook, line, sinker. Old man can't even remember what he signed last week. My hands started to shake. Not the kind of shaking that comes from cold or age. The kind that comes from your body understanding something before your mind is willing to accept it. I felt it once before, standing in a hospital hallway, when a doctor told me my wife Linda's scan didn't look right. That particular stillness inside a storm. I scrolled up slowly. There were weeks of messages, dozens of exchanges I was never meant to see. Jokes about my senior moments. The word confused came up more than once, always in quotation marks, always followed by a laughing emoji. References to the timeline, to the plan, to make sure I didn't get suspicious before the paperwork clears. These weren't the clumsy jokes of a son blowing off steam to his wife. There was a pattern here, a shared language built around my vulnerability, around my age, my trust, My habit of signing things Derek brought over without reading every line, property management forms, insurance updates, what he'd told me were routine landlord filings, the way fathers do when they still believe their children are on their side. I want to pause here and speak directly to whoever's watching this. If you're my age, if you've got grown kids who help you manage paperwork or finances, pay attention to what I'm about to tell you, because I was a careful man, a smart man, and it still happened to me. I wanted to stop reading. Part of me, the part that still loved my son, the part that had coached his little league team and drove him to college orientation and sat in the front row at his wedding, that part wanted to put the phone back on the counter and pretend I'd seen nothing. But I've never been a man who runs from hard truths. Not at 30, not at 50, not now. I pressed the home button, opened the screenshots folder, and started photographing every exchange. My hands were trembling, but my eyes were clear. I worked quietly, methodically, the same way I used to sort the morning mail on a route I could have walked blindfolded. When I set the phone back down, I stood very still. Something had cracked inside me. Not broken, cracked, the way old wood splits along a grain line that was always there, waiting for the right pressure. The messages I hadn't read yet were worse. I kept scrolling, and that's when I saw the message that made my blood run cold. There's a state-run place in Sun City, $900 a month. He won't know the difference. I had to read it twice, then a third time. The message was from Derek, and Nicole had sent the one before it. Once the properties transfer, how long before we can move him? 6 words I will never forget for the rest of my life. Once the properties transfer. How long before we can move him? Not, should we help Dad if he needs care someday? The kind of conversation a good son has with his wife when a parent gets older. This was logistics. This was scheduling. This was my son and my daughter-in-law sitting in their kitchen. Probably the same kitchen where I'd installed their dishwasher, where I'd sat eating Nicole's pot roast on Christmas Eve, calculating how quickly they could have me removed from my own life once they'd taken everything worth taking. Derek's reply came in under a minute. 6 months tops. There's a state-run place in Sun City, $900 per month, and he won't know the difference. And then Nicole sent a laughing emoji. A laughing emoji. I set the phone down on the counter and pressed both hands flat against the tile. The cool of it grounded me. I breathed, in through the nose, out slow through the mouth, the way my doctor told me when my blood pressure started creeping up. I breathed, and I looked out the kitchen window at the oleanders I'd just been trimming, still and green in the afternoon light. My father died at 71, lung cancer, fast and hard, but he died in the house he'd lived in for 40 years, in his own bed, in his own town. We were all around him at the end. Me, my sister Rosa, his brother Hector. He knew every face in that room. He held my hand and called me by my name. I swore at his graveside that I would do the same, that I would live my years in my own home, on my own terms, for as long as God allowed, that I would not become a number in a state facility, forgotten on a Tuesday. My son had a different plan. He wasn't putting me in a home because I needed help. He wasn't worried about my safety or my meals or my medication. He was planning to extract what I'd spent a lifetime building, the properties, the equity, the quiet financial security I'd assembled dollar by dollar, and then park me somewhere cheap and out of the way so I'd stop being an inconvenience to the transaction. $900 a month, 6 months. He won't know the difference. I photographed those messages with the steadiest hands I'd had all afternoon, because I understood now there was more to find. The nursing home plan was the destination, but I still didn't know the full road they'd built to get there. I kept scrolling. What came next turned betrayal into something with a legal name. And then I saw the message that changed everything. Used the signature from his property tax forms. Looks perfect. My own son had forged my name and put my life's work up as collateral. The message was dated 2 months earlier. A Thursday. I would have been at my neighbor Carl's place that Thursday. We play cards on the first Thursday of every month. Have for years. Derek knew that routine. He'd grown up watching me keep it. He'd referenced it once, years back, as proof I was set in my ways. I'd taken it as a compliment. Now I understood how useful my predictability had been to him. Derek had written to Nicole, signed the paperwork today. He used the signature from his property tax forms. Looks perfect. Those forms. I keep a file in the kitchen drawer. Property tax documents, insurance renewals, landlord filings. Derek had helped me organize that drawer 3 years earlier, after Linda passed, when paperwork had piled up and I'd let him take over the filing for a few months while I got my footing back. He'd had full access. He'd known exactly where my signature appeared, exactly how it looked on official documents, and exactly how to replicate it well enough to satisfy a lender reviewing a stack of loan applications. Nicole's reply, "How much equity?" Derek, $340,000 across all three. Should clear $200,000 after the loans. $340,000 in equity. My equity, built across 3 decades of calculated sacrifice. The first rental property, a small block house on Dobson Avenue, I bought in 1987 for $67,000. Every dollar I'd saved in 7 years of postal work, plus a loan from my uncle Ernesto that I paid back in full within 4 years. I drove a 1981 Ford pickup with a cracked dashboard and no air conditioning for 6 years after that purchase because I refused to carry more debt than I had to. The second property, on Alma School Road, came in 1994. The third, a duplex off Gilbert Road, in 2003, the year Derek graduated high school. I remember thinking that summer that I'd built something real, something that would last. I'd skipped vacations, worn old boots, renegotiated my insurance 4 times to keep the margins right. Every one of those decisions lived in my body the way hard work does, in the joints, in the habits, in the automatic thrift of a man who knows exactly what things cost because he paid for them himself. And Derek had lifted my signature off a tax form and handed it to a lender, borrowing against $187,000 in loans, well beyond his gambling debt, using the excess to buy himself time and cover the interest and threats that had been mounting while he figured out his exit. My vision went briefly soft at the edges. Then it cleared. I photographed every remaining message in that thread, checked timestamps, noted the lender's name, which appeared once in an earlier exchange, on the notepad by the kitchen phone. Then I set Derek's phone back exactly where he'd left it, walked to the living room and sat in my chair. The answer to who I needed to call came quickly. It always does, with the people you truly count on. Maria, my daughter. In everything that followed, she is always the part of this story I tell, with something close to gratitude. She picked up on the second ring. I called my daughter Maria in Portland, and the second she heard my voice crack, she said, "Dad, what's wrong?" And when I told her, she went dead silent for 10 seconds, then said, "That's wire fraud, Dad. That's a federal prison." Maria is 43 years old, 45 now as of last month. She's a certified public accountant, been one for 16 years, runs her own small firm in Portland, with 2 junior accountants working under her. I used to joke that she got her head for numbers from her mother Linda, and her stubbornness from me. That Sunday afternoon, I was more grateful for both than I've ever been for anything. She answered on the 3rd ring. Voices in the background. She was in a meeting. She excused herself. A door closed, and then it was just her. I told her everything. The phone on the counter, the preview text, the messages about my memory, the nursing home in Sun City, the forged signatures, the equity loans, the $340,000. I talked for almost 15 minutes without stopping, and Maria didn't interrupt once. When I finished, the silence lasted long enough that I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Then she said quietly and clearly, "Dad, that's wire fraud. That's a federal prison." She asked me to send every screenshot immediately before Derek realized his phone was gone. I did it while she stayed on the line. I heard her opening files, clicking through images, her breathing steady and professional in a way that made me feel like maybe, I wasn't drowning after all. Don't confront Derek, she said. Don't change anything. Don't let him know you know. Act completely normal. Maria, he's coming back for his phone in about an hour. Then hand it to him and smile, she said. Can you do that? I told her I could. She said she'd be on the first flight to Phoenix in the morning. We'd sit down together, organize everything, and figure out next steps properly. Don't call anyone else tonight, she said. Not a lawyer, not Carl, nobody. Just me. Before she hung up, Dad, we're going to bury him. I believed her. Derek came back 2 hours later, knocked twice the way he always does, then let himself in with the spare key I'd given him 8 years ago. Relaxed, smiling, left my phone. Pops, you mind if I grab it? I pulled it off the counter and handed it to him without a word about what I'd seen. Have you eaten yet? He asked. I'm fine, I said. He left 4 minutes later. I stood at the front window and watched his taillights disappear down the street. Then I sat back in my chair, held my hands together in my lap, and breathed. I smiled at the man who'd forged my name. I didn't know yet if that took strength or something else entirely, but I knew morning couldn't come fast enough. Maria walked into my house the next morning, set her laptop on the kitchen table, and said, Dad, we're going to document everything, and then we're going to call the police. But first we need him to confess. She'd taken the 6 a.m. flight, had her laptop bag, a legal pad and a leather cover, and in the same expression I'd seen on her face once before, at Linda's funeral, when Maria decided to be the one who handled all the arrangements so I wouldn't have to. That particular determined calm she carries better than anyone I know. We sat at the kitchen table, the round oak table I bought at an estate sale in 1998, the one that's hosted 30 years of Sunday dinners, birthday cakes, homework sessions, and holiday reconciliations. Now, it was a war room. Maria organized the screenshots chronologically, then pulled up my bank statements and cross-referenced them against the property records she accessed through the county assessor's website. She worked for 2 hours, with barely a word between us. I made coffee and stayed out of her way. When she finally looked up, her face told me enough before she spoke. 3 forged signatures, 2 fraudulent home equity loans, one against Dobson Avenue, one against Alma School Road, one business line of credit against the Gilbert Road duplex. Total exposure, $187,000 in debt now attached to my properties without my knowledge or consent. The amount exceeded Derek's gambling debt of $73,000 because, Maria explained, he'd borrowed against the full available credit to cover compounding interest, collection threats, and what appeared to be payments to intermediaries who'd been pressuring him for months. This is prosecutable, Maria said, but we need more than screenshots. Prosecutors will want corroboration. We need Derek to confirm the details himself, on record. She explained it simply. If Derek acknowledged the loans in conversation, confirmed I had allegedly signed them, admitted to managing the money, that, layered on top of the documentary evidence, would make the case airtight. I want you to invite him over, she said. I'll set up a recorder, and you ask about the paperwork. Let him fill in the blanks. I looked at my hands for a moment. Maria, I said, that's my son. She held my gaze without wavering. Dad, she said, he stopped being your son the day he forged your name. The words landed hard, not because they were cruel. Maria has never been cruel a day in her life. They landed hard because they were true, and truth delivered without decoration has a weight that softer words never carry. I thought about the Dobson Avenue house, the cracked dashboard on that old Ford, my Uncle Ernesto's loan, repaid in full. I thought about Nicole's laughing emoji. I nodded. Tell me what I need to do, I said. Maria picked up her pen, and we got to work. I texted Derek on Tuesday and told him I wanted to talk about refinancing one of the properties, and he replied in 30 seconds, Sure, Pops? 6 p.m. Thursday? Like he couldn't wait to twist the knife a little deeper. I stared at that word for a long time. Pops. He'd called me that since he was about 14, the age when Dad starts to feel too formal, and boys are looking for something that sounds casual, a little affectionate. I'd always liked it, though it meant we were easy with each other, the kind of father and son who could talk, Now it felt like a costume, something he wore to keep me trusting him. I texted back, "See you then, son." Maria spent Wednesday evening setting up the recording equipment, a small digital voice recorder, the kind she uses for client meetings, threaded into the breast pocket of my gray cardigan, on the one I wear when the evenings cool down. She tested it 3 times, clear enough to pick up both sides of a normal conversation at a kitchen table. Then she showed me where she'd wait. My bedroom is just off the kitchen hallway, door left slightly open, 12 feet from where Derek and I would be sitting. She set up the baby monitor, receiver in the bedroom with her, transmitter on the kitchen windowsill behind a plant. I'd bought that baby monitor in the spring of 1986, the year Derek was born. I was 28 years old, 3 years into my postal route, and I'd saved for 3 months to buy the best one in the store, because that's the kind of father I intended to be. It had sat in a box in the garage for decades. Maria found it when we were going through Linda's things after she passed. I'd kept it without knowing why. I knew why now. Thursday came, the way hard days always do, looking just like any other from the outside. Blue sky, dry air, a pair of quail working their way along the back wall. I made coffee at 5:30 the way I always do. I read the paper. I watered the pots on the front step. I did the ordinary things because ordinary things anchor a man when the day ahead is anything but. At 6 o'clock, Derek's truck pulled up. He came in carrying a manila folder, tabbed, organized, clipped. He'd prepared. That told me something. He wasn't going to simply play along with whatever he assumed I'd forgotten. He had a version of events constructed and ready to walk me through. He set the folder on the table and settled into the chair across from mine like he owned the room. I poured him coffee. He accepted without looking up from his folder. "So what's the question, Pops?" he said, flipping pages. "You seemed a little fuzzy on the phone about what was happening with the properties." He said fuzzy the way you'd say it about a man you'd already written off. I sat down across from him. The recorder is warm against my chest. I took a breath, and I began. "Son," I said, "I've been thinking about the properties." I asked Derek point blank, "Did I sign loan documents for all 3 properties?" And he looked me right in the eye, sipped his coffee, and said, "Yep, you wanted to consolidate equity, remember?" And that's when I knew I had him. I'd started slow, the way Maria coached me, vague and a little uncertain, not hard to perform, given how I actually felt sitting across from my son knowing what I knew. I asked about the refinancing paperwork from January. He said I'd been trying to recall the details and was getting confused. Derek's whole posture shifted. He leaned back slightly, crossed one leg over the other, and smiled the particular smile of a man who believes he's the smartest person in the room. "Dad," he said, with that patient, slightly exhausted tone people use with children and the elderly, "we went over this. You signed the docs in January. You don't remember?" "I'm not sure I do," I said. He laughed, short and soft. "That's exactly why Nicole and I are helping you manage all this. You're getting a little forgetful. It's normal at your age. Nothing to be embarrassed about. Nothing to be embarrassed about." I kept my face still. "So I signed loan applications for all 3 properties?" I asked. "You signed what needed to be signed," he said, reaching into the folder. "I've got copies here if you want to look them over again." He slid papers across the table. I glanced at them without touching. I could see my signature, or what looked enough like it to pass at a distance. It looked close, not perfect to my eye, but close enough that I understood how it had passed through a lender's process, buried in a stack of forms, submitted by a man presenting himself as a dutiful son, managing his elderly father's estate. "And the money from the loans," I said, folding my hands on the table. "Where does that stand?" He paused, half a second, barely detectable. Then he picked up his coffee cup. "It's being invested," he said. "I'm managing it. Trust me, Pops. This is going to work out really well for the family." For the family. I looked at him for a long moment. My son, 38 years old. I remembered driving him home from the hospital, his whole body fitting in the crook of my elbow. I remembered teaching him to throw a baseball in the backyard of the first house Linda and I owned on Glendale. I remembered the pride I felt at his college graduation, thinking I'd done my part. I I reached into my cardigan pocket and pressed the stop button on the recorder. Then I stood up. "Get out of my house," I said. It came out calm, quieter than I expected. The voice of a man who has made a decision and will not be talked out of it. Derek looked up from his coffee. For the first time since he'd walked through my door, his expression changed. Something behind his eyes shifted. Not guilt, not yet. Confusion. The confusion of a man who cannot locate where the ground went. "Pops, leave your key on the counter," I said, "and get out." What came next moved faster than either of us expected. I walked to the kitchen drawer, pulled out every screenshot I'd printed, threw them on the table, and said, "I read every single message between you and Nicole," and I watched my son's face go white as a sheet. I'd kept those printouts in the drawer since Tuesday, 41 pages, organized chronologically the way Maria had shown me, paper-clipped into 4 sections. I'd looked at them every morning since, just to make sure I hadn't dreamed any of it. I hadn't. They landed on the table between us with a flat, final sound. Derek stared at them. For about 3 seconds he was completely still, the way an animal freezes when it hears something in the brush and hasn't decided yet whether to run or hold. Then the color left his face, not gradually, all at once, like water draining from a sink. "Dad," he said. "What's wrong?" "What's wrong," I said, "is I found your phone, unlocked, on my counter, and I read every single message between you and Nicole. Everyone." He reached for the papers. I slapped his hand away. Not hard, but sharp and deliberate. "Don't," I said. "Touch." He pulled his hand back like he'd burned it. His mouth opened and closed. I watched him search for some version of events that explained this away, some foothold to grab onto, and I watched him find nothing. "Dad, it's not. You don't understand. There's context you're not." "I understand," I said, "that you forged my signature on 3 loan documents. I understand you mocked me in text messages to your wife. I understand that you and Nicole sat in your kitchen and laughed about putting me in a state-run facility in Sun City for $900 a month because you thought I wouldn't know the difference." Derek's jaw tightened. I could see him calculating, shifting strategies the way a man does when the first lie fails, and he's reaching for the second. "We were joking," he said. "Dad, you're taking things out of context. Nicole was venting. I was venting. Couples say things to each other that don't mean—" "You recorded nothing," I said. "But I did." That stopped him. 30 minutes ago," I said, keeping my voice level and quiet. "You sat in that chair and told me you signed loan documents on my behalf. You told me the money was being invested. You told me to trust you." I reached into my cardigan pocket. I had a recorder running the whole time. Derek didn't speak. He just stood there. And for the first time in that conversation, for the first time in God knows how long, my son looked at me with something that wasn't calculation or contempt. He looked at me with fear. Good, I thought. Now you know how I felt reading those messages. I didn't say that. I've never been a man who kicks when someone is already down. But I thought it. Whatever Derek believed he'd built, the carefully managed version of his father, the useful, forgettable old man who signed what he was handed, that was gone now, and he knew it. What I didn't know yet was how far he'd actually fallen. That came next. Derek collapsed into the chair, put his head in his hands and said, "Dad, I'm in trouble. I owe people money, bad people." And for 1 second, I almost felt sorry for him until I remembered he'd called me senile and laughed about it. That 1 second passed quickly. He sat with his elbows on his knees, his face hidden in his palms, his shoulders shaking in the way men's shoulders shake when they've been holding something enormous for too long and the weight finally wins. I'd seen that posture before, in the mirror, the week after Linda passed, when I thought no one was watching. I didn't move toward him. I stood by the counter and waited. After a while, he looked up. His eyes were red, his face wet. He looked older than 38, smaller. "I was going to pay it back," he said. "Dad, I swear, I just needed time. I never meant for it to go this far." "How much do you owe?" I asked. He looked away. 73,000. I had suspected drugs. That had been my first thought when Maria and I sat at this table and laid out the timeline. Or maybe another woman. the kind of trouble men get into when they're trying to fill something empty inside them. But it was gambling. Poker, he said, started a few years back. Small games with friends, then bigger games, then the kind of games where the other men at the table aren't your friends, and the money owed doesn't stay polite for long. You put my homes up as collateral, I said slowly. The houses I bought in 1987 and 1994, the duplex. You leveraged my life's work against a poker debt. Derek flinched like I'd struck him. I panicked. He said, I didn't know what else to do. You could have called me, I said. You could have walked through that door on any given Sunday and said, Dad, I'm in trouble. I would have helped you. You know that? He started to sob. Real sobs. Not the performative kind, but the ugly, uncontrolled kind that a man can't manufacture. And somewhere beneath the anger, beneath the cold clarity I'd been carrying all week, I felt something break loose. A small, quiet grief. Not for the money or the properties or even the betrayal itself, for the version of my son that would never have done any of this. The boy I raised, and the one I believed I knew. I thought briefly of Caleb and Lily, my grandchildren, 6 and 4 years old, who had nothing to do with any of this and would carry the weight of it anyway. That thought I put away quickly, because there was nothing useful I could do with it in that kitchen. In that moment, I turned and looked out the window. Sorry, I said without turning back. Doesn't unforge my signature, and sorry doesn't give me back my son. Derek said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Behind me, I heard the bedroom door open. The part of this that was just between a father and a son was over. Maria walked out of the bedroom, looked Derek dead in the eye and said, You stopped being my brother when you called our father senile, and I've never been more proud of my daughter than I was at that moment. She came in quietly, and no announcement, no drama, just Maria, standing in the hallway entrance with her arms at her sides and her face set in the way I recognized, that particular expression that means every decision has already been made and she is only present now to execute it. Derek looked at her the way drowning men look at anything solid. Maria, his voice broke on her name. Please, talk to him. You know me. You know I'm not. I know exactly who you are, she said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. I've spent 4 days going through bank records, property filings, and loan documents while you were driving around thinking you'd gotten away with it. I know you better right now than I ever have. She crossed to the table and picked up one of the printed screenshots. The message about Sun City, the $900 a month facility, the laughing emoji. She held it up. This is who you are, she said. Derek turned to her fully, desperate, shifting to the sibling angle the way a man shifts his weight when one leg gives out. I'm your brother, he said. We grew up in this house. You can't just... You stopped being my brother, Maria said, when you called our father senile, when you joked about warehousing him in a state-run facility and sent a laughing emoji, when you forged his name on legal documents. She set the screenshot flat on the table. Blood doesn't cover that. She looked at me. Dad, she said, I spoke with the attorney this morning. Everything is in order. The screenshots, the recording, the forged documents. She says the case is strong. We file the police report tomorrow morning at 8. I nodded. Derek stood. He moved toward me, not aggressively, but with the desperate energy of a man making a final appeal, hands slightly raised. Maria pointed to the door. Leave, she said, right now, before I call the police tonight instead of tomorrow. He stopped. He looked at Maria, then at me, then at the floor. There was a long moment where no one in that kitchen moved or spoke, and the only sound was the refrigerator cycling on and the distant noise of someone's lawn mower 3 houses down, the ordinary world continuing on, completely indifferent to what was falling apart inside. And Derek picked his folder up off the table, the same organized, tabbed folder he'd walked in with an hour ago. So confident, so prepared. He tucked it under his arm. He walked to the counter and set his spare key down without being asked twice. Then he walked to the door. I looked at Maria. She was watching him go, her posture still, her face quiet and resolute. I had lost a son. But I had not lost everything, not even close. Derek stood at the door, turned back and said, "I love you, Dad." And I looked at him and said, "If you loved me, you wouldn't have stolen from me." And then I watched him walk out of my life. He'd had his hand on the doorknob. I thought he was going to open it and leave without another word, and part of me had been grateful for that, grateful to be spared whatever came next. But he stopped. He turned, and he looked at me the way he used to when he was 7 years old and had broken something and was hoping the love between us would absorb the consequences. It wasn't enough then either, but back then, the broken thing was a lamp. "Dad," he said, "please, I'll go to rehab. I'll get help. I'll find a way to make this right. Don't do this. Not to my family." I looked at him, really looked. The way you look at a person when you understand it may be the last time. I looked at the set of his jaw, the shape of his nose, the way he stood with his weight slightly forward, a habit he'd had since he was a teenager. All of it is familiar, all of it mine, in the way that children are yours. And I felt, looking at him, that I was looking at a stranger, not because he'd changed. I think, standing there in that moment, and I understood that he hadn't changed at all, that this version of him had always been there underneath the Sunday visits and the borrowed tools and the pops, waiting for the right pressure to surface. What had changed was my ability to see it. "You're not the son I raised," I said. "I don't know who you are anymore." His face crumpled. Then, "I love you, Dad." The last card, played at the door, with one hand on the knob, the way men play it when everything else has failed. "If you loved me," I said, "you wouldn't have stolen from me." He looked at me for one more second. Then he opened the door and walked out. The latch clicked shut behind him. Maria's hand came to rest on my shoulder, warm and steady. She didn't say anything, and I was glad of that. There's a kind of silence between people who love each other that is more useful than words, and she'd always known when to offer it. I looked at the kitchen table, the scattered screenshots, 41 pages of my son's contempt for me, laid out under the kitchen light. My life's work. 3 houses, 37 years, every careful dollar, almost taken. "Tomorrow," I said. "Tomorrow," Maria said. I didn't cry. I was past crying. What I felt was quieter than grief and steadier than anger. It was resolved, the kind you build a life on, the kind that was going to walk into a police station at 8 o'clock the next morning and not look back. I sat across from Detective Sarah Chen, played her the recording of Derek admitting to forging my signature, and she looked up and said, "Mr. Rodriguez, and this is textbook identity theft. Your son is looking at serious prison time." We arrived at the Mesa Police Department at 8 o'clock on the dot. Maria had been up since 5. I hadn't slept much past 3. We drove over in my truck without talking much, the kind of quiet between two people who've already said everything that needs saying and are now just moving toward what has to be done. Detective Chen was with the Financial Crimes Unit, mid-40s, neat, efficient, the kind of woman who's heard 100 versions of this story and still takes every one of them seriously. She shook my hand, offered coffee, and sat across from us with a legal pad and a patience I was grateful for. I handed everything over in order. The screenshots, printed and organized in Maria's labeled sections. The property records with the flagged discrepancies. The forged loan documents Maria had obtained through the county. And last, the recorder. Chen listened to the recording twice. The second time she made notes without looking up, her pen moving steadily. When it finished, she examined the forged signatures through a magnifying lens she pulled from her desk drawer. Then she looked at me. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said, "this is textbook identity theft and forgery. Given that the loans cross state lines through the lenders involved, federal wire fraud charges are possible as well. Your son is looking at serious time." She asked if I wanted to press charges. I've asked myself that question every night since Sunday. I'd sat in my chair in the dark and turned it over the way you turn something heavy in your hands, looking for a side of it you can live with. There wasn't one that didn't hurt, but there was one that was right. "Yes," I said. I didn't hesitate. Chen nodded once, like that was the answer she expected from a man who'd walked in the way I'd walked in. "We'll begin the investigation process today. Financial fraud cases of this nature take time to build properly. Weeks, sometimes longer. But the evidence you've brought is strong. We'll be in touch. Maria leaned forward. What about asset protection in the meantime? The properties are still technically encumbered. Chen walked us through it methodically. Freeze credit. Contact each lender directly with the police report number. File fraud affidavits with notarized handwriting samples. Flag the deeds with the county registrar. Maria wrote everything down in her shorthand on the legal pad. We were out of the police department by 10:15. I sat in the passenger seat of my own truck while Maria drove, and I watched Mesa roll by outside the window, the strip malls and the palm trees and the morning light on the mountains to the east. The same city I'd delivered mail in for 34 years. Still here, still standing. The wheels of justice moved slower than the movies suggest, but they were moving, and that was enough for that morning. I spent 2 days calling every single lender Derek had scammed, saying the same thing over and over. I did not sign these documents. My signature was forged by my son, and every time I said it out loud, it felt like swallowing broken glass. There were 3 of them. Chase Bank handled the home equity line on Dobson Avenue. Wells Fargo held the second equity loan against Alma School Road. The third, a business line of credit against the Gilbert Road duplex, ran through a private equity firm out of Scottsdale that Maria had tracked down through the loan documentation. I made each call from the kitchen table. Maria sat across from me with the evidence folder open, passing me documents and policy numbers when I needed them, writing down names and case numbers while I talked. Each call ran between 30 and 45 minutes. Each one required me to explain, in plain language, to a voice on the other end of the line that my son had taken my name and used it to steal from me. By the third call, I could say the words without my voice breaking, not because it hurt less, because a man gets a certain kind of tired that takes him beyond the point where emotion is useful, and the only thing left is the task in front of him. I filed fraud affidavits with all 3 institutions, provided handwriting samples the way Detective Chen had instructed so they'd hold up properly, and had everything notarized at the UPS store on Gilbert Road, the same place I've been going for 15 years. Maria filed parallel challenges with the county registrar, flagging all 3 properties as disputed pending fraud investigation. We worked Monday and Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, confirmation came through on all 3. The properties were flagged, the loans frozen, the internal investigations opened by each lender. Maria added the confirmation emails to the folder that had started as 41 screenshots and was now 3 inches thick and growing. They're protected, Maria said, closing the folder and setting it on the corner of the table. I sat back and pressed both hands over my face for a moment, not crying, just a man who hadn't slept properly in 5 days. How man holding more than a person should have to hold alone. Then I dropped my hands and looked at the folder. Everything I'd built since 1987, every lean year, every careful decision, every truck driven past its reasonable lifespan, fought for again in 2 days of phone calls and paperwork at my own kitchen table. The properties were safe. The investigation into Derek was now formally underway, and all we could do was let the process work. That process, I would learn, moves on its own timeline, but it moves. Detective Chen called on a Thursday morning, nearly 2 months after we'd filed the report, and said, "We arrested Derek Rodriguez at 6 a.m. He's being charged with identity theft, forgery, and fraud." And instead of feeling relieved, I felt my knees buckle. Maria caught my arm. I hadn't even realized I'd moved, had reached for the counter without knowing it, the way you reach for something solid when the ground shifts. She took the phone from my hand, spoke to Chen briefly, asked about the timeline and what we needed to do next. I stood by the sink and looked out the window at the backyard. The oleanders were in full bloom now, pink and full. I'd trimmed them the afternoon Derek left his phone on my counter, and they'd pushed out new growth since then, indifferent to everything that had happened inside the house. Things keep growing. That's what they do. Maria hung up and stood next to me. "It's done, Dad," she said. I nodded, but what I felt wasn't what I'd expected. I'd expected relief, the clean, exhaled kind that comes when something difficult is finally finished. What I felt instead was a low, quiet grief that had nothing to do with the properties or the money or the fraud. It had to do with the boy in the photographs on my hallway wall, the one at Little League, the one at his college graduation, the one who'd called me Pops for 30 years. My son was in jail because he'd chosen to be, because he'd made decisions, one after another, that led directly to a pair of handcuffs at 6 in the morning. I knew that. I held on to that. My phone rang 40 minutes later. Nicole. She didn't wait for me to speak. "How could you do this?" she screamed. "He's your son. You put your own son in jail. What kind of father does that?" I listened for about 10 seconds. Then I hung up. She called back immediately. I blocked her number. Maria, who'd heard enough from across the kitchen, said quietly, "She's panicking because she's implicated. Her messages are in those screenshots too. She knows what's coming." What stayed with me that morning, what has stayed with me since, was the word chosen. Derek chose gambling over responsibility, chose theft over honesty, chose contempt over the simple dignity of coming to his father and telling the truth. That wasn't on me. I finished my coffee. The bail hearing was set for the following Monday, and I had a decision of my own still to make before then. I sat in that courtroom and watched my son shuffle in wearing county orange and handcuffs. And when he looked at me with those desperate eyes, I turned my head and looked at the wall, because I knew if I met his gaze, I might break. Maria and I sat in the third row on the left side. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Beige walls, fluorescent light, and the smell of recycled air and institutional coffee. A handful of other cases had been called before Derek's. I sat through them without really hearing them, my hands folded in my lap, my eyes on the side door. He came through it at 10:43. The orange was what hit me first. The specific flat orange of county detention, the kind you can't mistake for anything else. His wrists were cuffed in front of him. He was unshaved. He looked like he hadn't slept, which I understood, and was older than 38 somehow, which is what consequence does to a person's face when it finally arrives. He found me in the third row the moment he cleared the door. His eyes went straight to me the way they always had as a boy. The instinct of a child looking for his parent in a crowd. Some things don't leave a person, no matter what they've done. I looked at the wall to my left. Cream-colored paint, a scuff mark at shoulder height, an exit sign above a side door. I looked at those things and kept my breathing steady. The prosecutor outlined the charges clearly. 3 counts of identity theft, 3 counts of forgery, 1 count of wire fraud, total financial exposure, $187,000. Derek's public defender, a young man with a loosened tie who'd probably handled 40 bail hearings that week, argued for release on the basis of no prior record and strong community ties. The prosecutor responded that the defendant had demonstrated active, sustained deception over multiple months, carried significant gambling debts to parties unknown, and that the primary victim, a family member, had declined to post bail. The judge set it at $50,000. Derek looked at me again. I stood up and walked out. Maria was beside me before I reached the hallway door. Outside, the Arizona morning was already warm and sharp, the light clean and hard the way it gets before the summer arrives in full. "You okay?" Maria asked. I thought about it honestly before I answered. "I will be," I said, and I meant it. Not today, maybe not this week, but the road forward was clearer now than it had been in a long time. The rest was just walking it, one step, then the next. The prosecutor called and said, "Derek's lawyer wants a plea deal, significantly reduced charges and a shorter sentence. But I need to know what you want, Mr. Rodriguez, because you're the victim here." Several weeks had passed since the bail hearing, weeks of quiet that weren't really quiet, the kind of silence that hums with everything still unresolved. Every morning you wake up and have to remember all over again what your life has become. I was in the backyard when the call came, watering the pots, the ordinary work of an ordinary Tuesday morning. I sat down on the porch step and listened while the prosecutor walked me through it. Derek's attorney was proposing a guilty plea to 2 counts of forgery. In exchange, the identity theft charges and the wire fraud count. The federal exposure, the charges that carried the longest sentences, would be dropped. Derek would serve 18 months in a state facility, followed by supervised probation, full restitution of $187,000 ordered by the court. The plea means a guaranteed conviction and a guilty on record, the prosecutor said. Going to trial takes considerable time and carries more uncertainty for both sides. She paused. Your position matters here, Mr. Rodriguez. You're the victim. This is your life. I thanked her and said I'd call back by the end of day. I called Maria. She listened, asked 2 clarifying questions about the restitution terms, then went quiet for a moment. It's your call, Dad, she said finally. Either way, he goes to prison. This is just the question of how much. I sat with it after we hung up, made a sandwich I didn't eat, sat in my chair. I thought about Derek at 8 years old. We'd had a tire swing in the backyard of the old house in Glendale. And then he'd spend whole afternoons just spinning himself in slow circles and laughing at nothing in particular. A boy without a worry in the world because his father had made sure of it. Then I thought about the laughing emoji. $900 a month. He won't know the difference. I called the prosecutor back. I want him to plead guilty, I said. I want full restitution on record, and I want the opportunity to speak at sentencing. I paused. I want him to sit in that courtroom and hear what he did, not from the prosecutor, not from a judge, from me. That's what victim impact statements are for, she said. Then I want one, I said. I had things to say that I hadn't said yet. Not to Maria, not to Detective Chen, not to the wall of that courtroom during the bail hearing. Things that were mine alone to say, and Derek's alone to hear. I had some writing to do. I sat down to write my victim impact statement, stared at a blank page for 20 minutes, and then I wrote the hardest sentence I've ever put on paper. I raised my son to be honest. He repaid me by forging my signature and planning to warehouse me like garbage. Maria had flown back to Portland the week before. She'd offered to stay longer, but I told her I was fine, and mostly I meant it. There are certain things a man has to do sitting alone at his own kitchen table, and this was one of them. I had a fresh legal pad, a ballpoint pen I buy in 3 packs at the pharmacy, have used the same kind for years. I sat down on a Wednesday evening and wrote the date at the top of the page. Then I stopped. I'd been thinking about what to say for weeks, turning phrases over in my head during the sleepless hours, during the long morning drives I'd started taking, just to give myself something to do with my hands. But sitting there with the blank page in front of me, everything I'd rehearsed felt wrong, too formal, too angry, too much like something performed rather than felt. I started with what was simple and true. Your Honor, my name is Vincent Rodriguez. I am 68 years old. I stopped again. What did I want to say beyond that? That my son had broken my heart? Anyone in that courtroom could see that without me saying it. That I was afraid to trust again. That I looked at every piece of paper anyone handed me now like it might be a trap. That felt too exposed. I've never been a man who made a display of his wounds, so I wrote what was factual and what was mine. I raised my son to be honest. I taught him that a man's word is his bond, that your name on a document means something, that you don't take what isn't yours, and that the people who love you deserve the truth. I sacrificed so he could have opportunities I never had. I bought him his first car. I helped with his down payment. I came when he called. I paused, looking at those words. Then I wrote the next ones. He repaid me by forging my name on 3 loan documents, by mocking my age in text messages to his wife, by planning to transfer my properties and move me into a state facility for $900 a month because he assumed I was too old and too confused to stop him. I set the pen down, picked it up again. I wrote for 2 hours, 3 pages, front and back, every betrayal laid out plainly, without exaggeration, because the plain truth was damning enough on its own. When I finished, I read it aloud to the empty kitchen, the way I used to read important letters to Linda before I sent them. My voice held until the last line. I am not asking for mercy, Your Honor. I am asking for justice. It cracked there, just slightly, just enough. I folded the pages, put them in the folder, and went to bed. The sentencing was Thursday. I stood at the podium, looked at the judge, and read the statement I'd written, and when I got to the part about Derek planning to dump me in a state-run nursing home, my voice broke, and I saw my son start to cry. The courtroom was small, fluorescent light, beige walls, a ceiling that hummed faintly at a frequency you feel more than hear. Derek was already seated when we came in, street clothes, clean-shaved, his attorney beside him. He looked like himself, and not like himself. Smaller, contained. He didn't look up when we entered, but I saw his jaw tighten. Nicole was absent. She had entered into a cooperation agreement with prosecutors in connection with a separate fraud investigation stemming from her own role in the message exchanges and planning. That chapter was still unfolding in the courts, and I had chosen to let it unfold without my involvement. My concern was the man at that table and the words I had carried for months. When Judge Martinez called my name, I stood, buttoned my jacket out of habit, and walked to the podium. I set the 3 pages flat in front of me. The courtroom went completely still. "Mr. Rodriguez," the judge said, "you may proceed." I read it the way I'd practiced, steadily, at a measured pace, the way you read something that matters and don't want to rush. I read about working 34 years for the Postal Service, about buying the Dobson Avenue house in 1987 with every dollar I'd saved, and a loan from my uncle Ernesto, repaid in full, about what it means to build something across 37 years, and what it means to have it stolen by the person you trusted most completely. When I reached the part about Sun City, $900 a month, he won't know the difference, my voice broke. I stopped, took one breath, continued. I heard Derek crying before I finished the page. I didn't look up when I read the final line. "I am not asking for mercy, Your Honor. I am asking for justice." I gathered my pages, stepped back from the podium, and sat down beside Maria. Judge Martinez looked at Derek for a long, deliberate moment before she spoke. "Mr. Rodriguez," she said, "you have betrayed the man who gave you life, home, and his complete trust. Your actions are not simply criminal in their nature, they are morally reprehensible. The court takes that seriously. 18 months, 3 years probation to follow, full restitution of $187,000 to begin upon release." As the bailiff moved toward Derek, he turned and found me in the 3rd row. "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered. I looked at him for one long, quiet moment. Then I picked up my jacket, stood, and walked toward the door. Maria fell into step beside me without a word. Outside, the Arizona sky was enormous and blue and completely indifferent to what had just happened inside. It was over, and the harder work, learning to live with what was left, was just beginning. 6 months after the sentencing, I was sitting on my porch watching the sunset over the desert, and I realized I wasn't angry anymore, just tired, and I was okay with that. That was the fall of 2024. I'm speaking to you now from February of 2026, so I've had another year and some months beyond that evening on the porch to keep thinking, keep adjusting, keep building the life that comes after something like this. It looks better than I expected. That's the honest answer. The Chandler property, a small rental I hadn't mentioned yet, separate from the 3 Derek had leveraged, that had become tangled in the chaos of the investigation. I sold in August of 2024. Too many associations by then, too much paperwork carrying his name alongside mine. I was glad to be done with it. Maria helped me find a financial advisor named Patricia, thorough, direct, no nonsense, who helped me reallocate the equity sensibly and rebuild the financial structure Derek had spent 2 years quietly undermining. My credit is fully repaired. The 2 remaining properties on Dobson and Alma School Road are clean, generating income the way they always have, managed now with eyes wide open. Derek served his 18 months and was released in early 2026. He's on probation, required to make restitution payments on a structured schedule that Patricia monitors on my behalf, so I don't have to think about it more than necessary. He wrote letters from the facility throughout his sentence, I left them on the corner of the kitchen counter for a day or two each time, then moved them to the drawer unopened. I have read none of them. Maria says that's my right, and I believe her. Nicole's separate case was resolved through a plea agreement of her own. Lesser charges, probation, community service. She has made no attempt to contact me, and I have made none to contact her. There are 2 small children, Caleb and Lily, caught in the middle of all of this, and I pray they're being raised well by whoever is steadying things around them. That is a grief I carry separately and quietly. I joined a men's group at my church in August of 2024, 8 of us, various ages, all navigating estranged children or fractured families. We meet Thursday evenings in the fellowship hall. We don't use language that makes grown men uncomfortable. We just talk, plainly, the way men talk when they've decided honesty is more useful than performance. It has helped more than I expected. Last month, Maria called. Derek's parole officer had reached out asking whether I'd be open to supervised visits. I watched the oleanders in the late afternoon light. No, I said. Not now. Maybe not ever. That's okay, Dad, Maria said. You don't owe him anything. I sat with that after we hung up. You don't owe him anything. It sounds harder than it is, said out loud, but it is the truth. And I've learned in these past 2 years that truth is the only foundation worth building on. My name is clean. My properties are mine. My dignity is intact. For tonight, for every night, that's enough. If you're watching this and you're my age, you know what I'm about to say. Blood doesn't guarantee loyalty, and sometimes the hardest thing you'll ever do is choose yourself over someone you love. I want to speak plainly one more time before this is done. I'm 68 years old, 69 next week, with a birthday Maria has already started organizing around, whether I asked her to or not. I've been sitting with this story for nearly 2 years, turning it over the way you turn a stone in your hand, examining it from every angle, looking for the part where I went wrong, looking for what I missed. Here's what I found. I didn't miss anything. I trusted my son because he was my son, and because 30 years of Sunday dinners and borrowed tools and half hugs at the door will convince a father that he knows a person. Sometimes you don't know a person. Sometimes the version of them you raised is real, and the version you discover later is also real, and you have to decide what to do when those 2 things can no longer coexist. Here's what I know now, that I wish someone had told me before, that Sunday in March of 2024. Trust your gut. When something feels wrong, a message you weren't meant to see, a document that appears without explanation, a family member who's suddenly very interested in your finances, don't dismiss it out of politeness or love. Don't tell yourself you're being paranoid. Your instincts were built over 60 or 70 years of reading people and situations. They are worth something. In my case, they were worth everything. Don't ignore red flags because the person holding them is family. Blood is not a guarantee. Loyalty is earned, the same as respect, the same as trust. A title, son, daughter, brother, does not override behavior. It never did. And if the day comes when you have to choose between protecting yourself and protecting a relationship, protect yourself. I know how that sounds. I know some people would call it cold. I call it survival. I lost a son. What I kept was my home, my future, my name, and my dignity. Those things are still mine, here in February of 2026, and they will be mine until the last day I have. Some evenings I sit on that porch and wonder who Derek might have been if the gambling had never found him, if he'd come to me when the debt started mounting instead of reaching for my signature on a tax form. I don't have an answer for that. I suspect I never will, but I'm still here, watering my pots in the morning, walking the properties, sitting with the men on Thursday evenings, teaching Tomas, a young postal worker I've taken under my wing, about patience, equity, and the long game, watching the quail work along the back wall in the February evening while the sun goes down over the desert in colors that still manage to surprise me after all these years in this city. That's a life. That's mine. If you've been through something like this, a betrayal inside the family, a child who took advantage, A moment when you had to choose yourself. I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me your story if you want to, or just say hello and let me know I'm not the only one out here. If this story meant something to you, please hit that like button. It helps more people find stories like this one. Subscribe if you want to hear more, and share it with someone who might need it today, even if they don't know it yet. Thank you for listening all the way to the end, for sitting with this alongside me. We are not alone in this, not a single one of us.